Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unexplained News Radio podcast, your news source for all things unexplained. And now, here's your host for the Unexplained News podcast, Margie K.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Margie K. I'm your host of Unexplained News. Welcome to the program this evening. We have a great show scheduled for you, and I know you're going to enjoy it, so stay put and don't go anywhere. I do want to remind you to visit my website, unexmedia.com, where you will see all the information about our radio shows, our books, and our new network coming up pretty soon, and more about that later. Also, Unexplained News Magazine returns in October this year. It's a quarterly magazine, and I know you're going to love it. Today on my show, I have a very special guest with me, Tom Ferrario. Tom has worked as a Divemaster, machinist, and electrical engineer on projects in the United States, Red China, and Bermuda. He has been an independent UFO researcher since 1969 to 1998, at which point Walt Andrus, the founder of MUFON, asked Tom to become a section director for MUFON. Later, Tom would go on to be assistant state director for Missouri MUFON, which is my position right now. He then co-founded the MUFON Dive Team with Debbie Ziegelmeyer, and Debbie is the state director for Missouri MUFON, and she's also on the MUFON board of directors. Tom then joined Ted Phillips as his assistant in 2006 and later became part of Ted's S.I.U. team. Tom assisted Ted Phillips on his Marley Woods project and his Tetra Mountain Moonshaft project. Over the years, Tom formed a close bond with Ted, and we're going to talk about all of that this evening. Welcome to the program, Tom.
Oh, Margie, good to be here again.
It's great to see you again. I'm glad you can join me this evening. I have been completely enthralled with the Marley Woods for years and years, and there are all kinds of rumors about what's going on down there. But first, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Ted Phillips. Just for people who might not know his history, why don't you give us a little background about him and what he did?
Yeah. Unfortunately, Ted passed away on March 10th last year. And Ted was born in Sedalia, Missouri. And he actually worked on the Vanguard missile tracking program. He was an engineer, and he was a professional musician, professional photographer, among other things. And he was just his personality was just, it was so wide and varied. You can't describe Ted. I mean, he was just a wonderful man to work with. And Ted always had an interest in ufology. And he, at an early age, his father worked in a radio station in Sedalia. And he introduced Ted to two World War II bomber pilots that had an experience with commonly known as what's reported Foo Fighters. Mm-hmm. And now these two bomber pilots had an experience. This was within 30 foot of their cockpit, these two Foo Fighters. So wow. He got to interview them. And as Ted said, it doesn't get any better than your first interview talking to two World War II fighter bomber pilots. So that really keyed his interest in it. And later on, he became an engineer, and he always followed his interest. And he formed a relationship with Professor Allen Hynek, which everyone knows of Blue Book. And what happened, a lot of people think it was in the Socorro, Mexico, Lonnie Zamora's case where Ted associated with him. But actually, I will tell you, there was a case equally as dramatic and important in ufology in Missouri that brought Allen Hynek to Missouri, is where Ted and Allen first met up. So that's just a little brief synopsis of Ted's history. And he spoke before the UN. He was a little known fact that when Project Blue Book ended, Ted worked with Allen on several years. And when Allen was asked or had to go overseas or work on projects, and he had prior engagements or his health wasn't that good at the time, he would send Ted on cases overseas. So Ted was really, even Stanton T. Freeman always said that Ted had more experience and knowledge than he felt anyone in the field. Mm-hmm. So that'll cover Ted.
He's well known as a trace evidence expert.
Physical trace cases. Yes.
Right. And among ufologists, the general public, he hasn't been so well known, but you're changing that. I know you've got some. Yes, indeed. Let's go back to that Missouri case for just a second. Can you talk about that case that he worked on in Missouri?
Yeah, it was in Columbia, Missouri, actually, and it was a case. It was a landing case, an incident that terrorized a family in a mobile home there for over 3 hours. And this thing came down through the trees. It left physical trace damage to the trees, landing site, left impressions, left a residue. Ted did compression analysis on the landing pads, and estimated each pad at a weight approximately of 1,200 pounds. So you're talking a lot of tonnage there overall, and typically that's what you'll find in a lot of cases is extreme weight. But that was the first case Alan and Ted worked on, and it really traumatized the family so much that they moved from the mobile home at that point and never came back to that park. So, but that is one of the cases, and we're working on trying to get the facts, the details. And I will just throw out there that Ted had, and I know it exceeds this because working in his office after he passed away, I'm trying to go through, categorize his records and go through some of his documentation, which is a monumental task, but he has over, the last estimation that Ted made was well over 3,000 physical trace cases that he had filed. So
that's just incredible. And that is a monumental task.
It is.
So how did you and Ted meet?
It's an interesting story. I started in MUFON thanks to Walt Andrus, which MUFON was started, a lot of people don't know this, in Missouri.
Right.
And Walt, I spoke to, and he convinced me to join MUFON after my experience. And so I did. And Bruce Whitteman, which was the state director there, did a lot of conferences, and I attended one of Ted's lectures, and I so respected the man, and he captivated me. The first time I watched one of his lectures, I was just so captivated. And my dream was always just to speak with Ted, not even in my wildest dreams thinking I could work with him. But at one of the conferences that he spoke at for Bruce Whitteman, I was helping Bruce with a conference, and I had a chance to be up alone with Ted. And I asked him, I said, man, I'd love to work with you someday, Ted. And I would treasure that. And he said, what could you help me with? And I said, well, what do you need? And he said, well, I'm working on a little project. And at the time, Marley Woods wasn't that well known.
A little project.
Said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm at that time an electrician by trade and did engineering jobs for a power boat company, Challenger Power Boats, did all their layout work. And I said, do you have any electrical work you need done? And he said, well, have you got a fear of heights? And I said, well, not really, no. So he, not thinking he'd take me up on it, he called me a week later and gave me roughly the address. And he said, I'll meet you in this town, and can you come out next week and help me set up cameras? So I did that and went out, and I was climbing 30-foot windmills, rickety old rusty windmills, putting up security cameras and monitoring devices and running wires and cables all over the place. And in this little office there, the property owner built for him in Marley. So that was our first relationship. And then over the years, we formed a close bond, and really, I just respected the man so much, his wealth of knowledge in every field. The man just, and his scientific approach, that was the main thing. He instilled in everybody that worked with Ted, he instilled that approach. And if you didn't want to adhere to that, you didn't have a place at Marley and you wouldn't be invited back. And that's an image of Ted and I. I'm at, I think about 3:15 a.m. in the morning, and you can see it in my face. And I rushed to Ted's side, and Adam Johnson was there too. That was a case where Ted had one of his most extreme experiences that evening at a remote monitoring station on Site 3 at Marley. But that was Ted in his prime right there, I'll tell you.
Yeah, and this one,
yes,
there's a special person there with you guys.
Yes, I treasure that association and being able to work with one of the premier people, not only in the United States, but in the world, Jacques Vallee. I learned so much from the man. And I will say at the same moment that picture was taken, we had another visitor that was, you may be familiar with the name Douglas Trumbull, that is big and did all the special effects and Space Odyssey 2001 and
oh wow,
so many Brainstorm and so many other Hollywood, but he's known in the field. He has a serious study, and he threw together a lot of instrumentation packages to try to capture UFOs. He brought a lot of equipment out in Marley, and he was working. I mean, that was a dream team we had with Jacques Vallee, Douglas Trumbull, Ted, Adam Johnson. And at that point, it was just incredible. And the man, I learned so much in that statement there, just about says it all, that, we are dealing with a yet unrecognized level of consciousness, independent of man, but closely linked to the earth. I do not believe anymore that UFOs are simply the spacecraft of the race. And I will just go into that, and learning from the man what I did, there was a consensus in the field. A lot of people, I know this steps on a lot of ufologists' toes, but if I had to put my money on any group of men on this planet, I would put it in Alan Hynek, Jacques Vallee, Ted Phillips, another gentleman, Ray Stanford, I worked with. And their consensus was that this is all frequency driven, which means it's dimensionally based. Now,
yes,
in layman's terms, what that means is this is all interdimensional. And they proved it. We proved it at Marley on so many cases. It just, at times, it doesn't obey our physics. And it's just a unique opportunity we had to work with Jacques Vallee, I will tell you.
Oh, I'll bet. Absolutely. That would have been fantastic. And I do have to say that I agree with you 100% on that opinion, because in my own experiences, and then in doing many investigations with other people, there just has to be, it has to be an interdimensional aspect to this, for many, many reasons. But one in particular is, you have an object that you're looking at and you see it's a solid object, and then it disappears, or some kind of a hole opens up and it goes into it and disappears through that.
Yes.
And I've witnessed that myself, and it is most bizarre. And the most rational explanation is it's interdimensional. So yeah, I think a lot of ufologists are finally coming around to this being a possibility. And I will say this, from the first time I met Ted, he was very straightforward and scientific, but later on he sort of opened up, and he knew that I was a remote viewer and a psychic, and and into paranormal. And he came out in one of our conferences. He spoke at a conference, and he's talking about paranormal events. And I'm like, Ted, what happened? What happened to you? And he told me, well, he's experienced this stuff, and so once you experience it, it's real.
Marley Woods happened to him. That's what. But and I will tell you just briefly. This is a little known fact with Ted and Alan. They were very close work together. Alan, when he started going down the road, from what his documentation and analysis led to, this being interdimensional, Ted was a nuts and bolts man, as you stated in the beginning, and that's where he wanted to be. He was out in the field, and at the time, Jacques Vallee was working with Alan. Jacques did his documentation, his paperwork, his software, and Ted was out in the field doing the physical trace, the pickup, doing the scientific work, almost like a detective work in the field. And he was happy with that. He could put his hands on, soil compaction test. He could take soil analysis. He could take first testimony from the witnesses. That's what he wanted to do. He loved and believed in the structured craft. And when Alan moved away with his hypothesis that this was all interdimensional, for a short time, that Ted and Alan actually had an outing over that subject. And Ted always said that Alan, and after his experience, because Ted had never seen anything, experienced much himself till Marley, but Ted later said that Alan was so far ahead of his time that it was just unbelievable. And Jacques Vallee also was ahead of his time. And like Ted, I will tell you that if you'd mentioned when I got into this, taking eyewitness testimony and for MUFON and local people in my small community, if you would have mentioned cryptids or Bigfoot or anything besides nuts and bolts, boy, I had an anger management problem. I didn't want to go there either. But I will tell you, I did a big turnaround like Ted did, living and breathing and dealing with this stuff on a daily basis. It can be nothing else. It just, it doesn't apply to our law of physics. And when it doesn't apply to our law of physics, there's only one place to go. And you know that, Marty. I mean, when you're dealing with cryptids and the wild, various descriptions of events, and it makes no physical sense.
And once you go down that rabbit hole, there's all possibilities.
Yes,
that come in.
And when these things are on,
I'll tell you too. I have been closed-minded about a lot of things as well, and then it happens to me or someone close to me, and I've got to rethink it. So, it's totally understandable. It's human nature.
It is. It is.
So let's talk a little bit about what Marley Woods is, and vaguely the area where it is, and how did Ted find out about it?
Ted got called in by Bruce Whitteman, and I will tell you that the property owners, after experiencing all this thing, they wanted answers. You go through peaks and valleys of activity out there. They were going through back then in the 90s an extreme amount of activity, and the property owners wanted answers, and they found MUFON, and they got a hold of Bruce Whitteman. And Ted at the time wasn't working with MUFON, but he was a friend of Bruce Whitteman. And Bruce told him about the case initially, what it entailed. And after he spoke with Ted, Ted initially didn't want to get involved till he read the reports, what one of the property owners had written. And it so resembled a case that Ted had dealt with overseas. And that's I won't go into that tonight, but I know you know about it. And it's a long, dramatic case that the minute Ted seen that correlation between what he had experienced overseas, he immediately called the property owner up and headed out there. So that's how Ted got involved at Marley Woods. And the first time he was out there, he didn't experience anything. The second time he did. And it was pretty dramatic.
And what was that?
He was actually out there and took a video camera, and he was speaking with a property owner, a little disenfranchised. He hadn't seen or heard anything yet. and he had the video camera in his hand. And he asked the property owner, he said, well, when does this stuff start? And the property owner looked at Ted and said, well, Ted, it's starting right in the north, which it typically starts in the north from the one ranch, the one office building there we had. And so Ted looked, and he went, just a seasoned professional he was, and he said, Tom, if this thing would have been a structure, a little disc with little guys crawling in and out of it, I'd have raised my camera and I'd have caught all of it. But he said, I stood there when this light, huge light, came out in front of us within 50 meters of us and changed such rich into amber colors, blues, any kind of hue at that time you could imagine, and flew between him and actually the old windmill out there. And Ted said, here I am, the seasoned professional with a camera in my hand. And he said, the property owner looked at me and said, well, Ted, I'm not an expert on this, but shouldn't you have the camera up filming this? Yeah. So Ted realized he raised the camera up and he got like 30 seconds, the best image he got of this thing flying by the windmill. So he said, that was my first experience actually, witnessing something myself. And it only got better from there for Ted, believe me, or more terrifying for Ted, I should say. Mm-hmm. But
I've got a couple of shots here. If you want to explain what these are.
Yes, that is what we called, Ted referred to as the light source. Now, he did a lot of work with filters and programs to pull out whatever he could out of that. He did pull an image out of a sort of a crystalline shield-shaped thing, which I think you have an image of also, but there it is. And that's through a lot of work getting to the center of this thing on one image. And the interesting thing about that image was that later on, and this was a process, I will tell you, of, Ted always said, if I would have used the word portal when I started out there, you should have just smacked me, he said. But Ted grew to believe this was actually a portal. And a couple images, we believe we have something coming out of it, actually. And as a portal is, that's another instant. That, besides the light ball imagery, that's some of the light balls at great magnification when they came out of one image, one light ball that dwarfed into 3 light balls in the northern sky. And but the image of the light source, what we experienced that was a portal, and how directional, which then again indicates, as Jacques said, that this thing is all dimensionally based. The property owner, we were viewing this on one case, and Ted so wanted the technology. He wanted if we'd have had a drone back then, he wanted to fly this right into this, what he believed the portal, that light source. But he said, Tom, let's try to get to that source on one occasion. We knew exactly the field it was in. It was actually about 1.5 miles away. We drove in our vehicle to the light source, and luckily the property owner was on the deck. He was viewing the light source. It did not change its intensity. It stayed the same as his viewing vantage point. Ted and I drove up to the source. We see no artifact of this light. We see nothing. And just thank God, on a fluke, I backed up, and the property owner said, and we had radio, we had 2-way communication. The property owner said, well, Tom, I can see your brake lights. You're right by it. And we said, we can't be. We see nothing. There's nothing here. And he said, well, your brake lights are right. He said, step on your brakes again. And I did. And he said, your brake light is just, he said, right next to this light. So explain that physically. You can't do it.
I have heard this from other investigative groups. And one in particular is the Joplin Spook Light, which is very famous. And that thing will appear, and you could have 2 groups of people on either side of it.
Yes.
And then as you approach it, then you can no longer see it, but the other group still sees it.
Yes.
So it seems to be as you get within a certain proximity, you can no longer see this, but
Yes.
it's still there. And
Yes.
then that, boy, explain that one.
You can't. Not with our physics. Not with our
Right.
physics, So, that's a little bit of what we dealt with. And I will tell you, there is so much more we dealt with out there. It's just, and Jacques Vallee himself, when he left his last day, he said, I truly believe there is more potential for high strangeness here and he spent time and worked, with Cone Keller at Skinwalker, and they wrote the book. And he said, but I believe there's more potential here than there is for high strangeness than there was at Skinwalker. Now
that's a lot.
That's saying a lot.
Because there's a lot going on at Skinwalker. And of course, that's very public now with the show they're doing.
Yes.
But a lot of us have been aware of that for many years because of, the first book that was written by the people who lived there on the ranch. And
Yes.
that's an extremely bizarre place.
It is.
But there are some very strange, a number of strange places in Missouri. The Joplin
Yes.
Spook Light, for one, the Marley Woods, and then there are, if you go further across the state, we've had the 1941 UFO crash at Cape Girardeau.
Yes, first, yeah.
And before any other crashes that were known. And then I'm working on 2 other crashes that are not known, one in St. Joe and one in Odessa, Missouri. And there's another one that is known in Columbia, Missouri. So, and then, of course, we've had some major UFO flaps here in this state. Do you have an opinion as to why all this strange stuff is happening, and not only in Marley Woods, but across the state?
Yeah, it's, there are so many opinions and theories on that. I don't know. And believe me, Ted looked for every avenue of explanation. He looked for Native American, content at Marley. And I will say just recently, we thought there was no Native American presence in Marley. Within the last year, we found out that we found proof that there had been an encampment of Native Americans very near Marley on a spring there. So, but Ted looked geologically. There are some large caves, large caverns that we feel could go under Marley Woods. The property owners believe there are caverns under Marley. They heard rumors of them when they were children, but we've never found any entrance on Marley that we know of. And we had Rodney Dillard out there that he does some psychic work, and he's a remote viewer and a witcher, water well witcher. And Rodney Dillard is one of the Dillards you might remember on the Andy Griffith show.
No.
That played the Darlings, And he lives in Branson, Missouri, and good friend of Ted's. But he believes there's caverns under Marley Woods. So, and we found cave complexes within a couple miles of Marley Woods that had large, complex, 3-tier caves that we feel could have easily went under Marley. So, but Ted was never able to put his finger on why Marley stood out from any one site in the area or Missouri. And it drove him really kind of crazy. He wanted to solve that riddle. But it goes back several generations in Marley, I will tell you. And it's just an incredible place. And
well, what else has gone on there besides the strange lights?
Yes.
What's happened?
We have our share of cattle mutilations there. In the early days, when Ted first started there was a fresh cattle mutilation. Ted was called in by on S.I.U, one of the ranchers. And I will just add that this compromise is 2 ranches. One's 1,200 acres and one approaches 1,000 acres. And it encompasses an area of 2 miles west and east and 3 miles north and south. So you can see the small team we had. That was a lot of real estate we dealt with when things would happen. But Ted was called in on a cattle mutilation, and Ted viewed it. It was typical cattle mutilation. Organs taken, defleshed areas, no predation on that carcass. And Ted asked the property owner, he said, well, how often does this go on? And he said, well, come with me, Ted. And he took Ted behind an old barn out there, and I've seen this myself with the remnants of it now. There was a pile about 30 foot wide on the ground and approaching. Ted said it looked like 10 or 11 foot in the air of bleached white bones and body parts from cattle.
Oh,
and he said,
my.
Yeah, he said, I put them there because that's the only place I don't want to deal with it. And he said, nothing will touch this stuff. And, but he said, that's all mutilations. The man had 3 calves show up missing and then later find pieces of the calves. And it goes on and on.
And the typical thing was no blood and no tracks and
yes,
no explanation. Right.
Yeah.
Were there any ever autopsies ever performed on any of these animals?
Yeah, the one local vet there was a good friend of the one rancher. Actually, I think he was actually related, and they could find no good reason for this. I mean, they weren't shot, of course. There wasn't predation. It wasn't. These things were just dropped in their tracks. And sometimes, again, as you know, a couple instances, it looked like they were dropped from extreme heights. So
yes.
What does that, and then it goes into, I will tell you, some of the most extreme animal mutilations I have heard anywhere in the United States. I've heard of it now overseas in one instance, but I mean, we had a horse mutilation in a barn there case that was just, and you know about that case, I know.
I do, and it's absolutely horrible.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even want to talk about that one. It's so bad. We won't torture the audience with that one. Let's just suffice it to say it's
very graphic,
complete and totally inexplicable as well. The cause had to be something completely unnatural.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about Bigfoot a little bit.
Yes.
I know that there have been some sightings and some strange things and even some evidence of Bigfoot there.
Yeah, now the only sighting in that county was very close to the boundaries of Marley Woods, which you might say just across the fence. It's the only sighting of Bigfoot in that county. It was in very close approximation of the site one. And we don't have physical traces of that. We heard there were some, but it was lost. But what we do have physical trace, good case on what you're familiar with, the large white animal that was seen at Marley. And it was a huge white animal. One of the ranchers seen one morning. The man could judge livestock within, 25 pounds. And he said at approximation, this was over 350 pounds, he felt, or more. And a large white polar bear / sloth type of critter. He got his rifle. He shot at this thing. He thought he hit it. He said in his words, I made it red. So he called us in there. And the really strange thing about this animal was, and he viewed it through his spy glasses, his hunting glasses, binoculars. He said this creature, after he thought he shot it and made it red, he said this thing walked through a 4-strand barbed wire fence. Now, it didn't go under the fence. It didn't go over the fence. He said it passed through this fence as if it was a ghost. But he said, and when we got there, we found 16-inch long white hairs on the top strand and the bottom strand of this fence. We took plaster castings of the footprints, which the one footprint is the size of my hand. It was not canine. It wasn't a cat. It was, and Ted sent in the hairs to a good person. I know you know the gal that ran the lab, Phyllis Budinger.
Yeah.
does extremely accurate, good work for Ted over the years. She did microscopy on the hairs, and the hairs came up, no known sample, no known match in microscopy. And Ted had an offer from some other people. He sent off the hairs. They did microscopy also, and we did not have the funding at the time, believe me, to do DNA work. But it so intrigued the people in this lab that they had really fundamental, very crude DNA work they were able to do at the time. Not microneal, but they just, and it so intrigued them. They said, we're gonna submit this, but you can't publish the results. We're not gonna go out on the limb, and we didn't pay for it, so we couldn't argue with them. But when they got done with the DNA work, they said it matched no known subject that they had. They were so intrigued by it that it just, there again, that was physical trace we had on this creature. Mm-hmm. Now, I will tell you, Ted was the first one to say this, and I believe it too. Do we think, and I'll just briefly say that the next day, this creature had never been seen in Marley on Site 1 or 2. The next day, the rancher's daughter was out there, took a camera with her, and she's the one that took the only known image of this creature at very high magnification. It's a very poor image, but it's the only thing we got, and it's something. But now, do we believe that there's a living, breeding population of this creature out there? We absolutely do not. We know it. There isn't. You could go through those ranches hand to hand with 1,000 men and never find these things. But when they're there, they're as real as you and I are. And when they're not there, they're not there. So,
well, the walking through the fence.
Yes. What explains that?
What are we talking about? An interdimensional creature with the Sasquatch?
It's in the form of transition, we believe, of some sort. If this thing was hit, was it in a transition state of going back where it was safe? We found no blood. We absolutely found no blood. And the rancher claims he had made this thing red. He seen what appeared to be red on the white fur. So,
do any of the ranchers, do they ever say they hear like tree knocks or whoops or yells or anything like that?
There are some audio oddities, not so much as tree knocks. And I will tell you, this is where it gets really, really strange. There has been what's heard by the one property owner has a caretaker that lives on Site 1. And the gentleman has a mobile home he lives in. He will not come out at night anymore, even when they used to run a lot of cattle. So you might ask, what good is a caretaker if he doesn't come out at night? But he has done this. He has such a fear at night because of what he's witnessed and observed and been a part of that. But I will tell you that on Marley grounds and the One County Road, there is a private cemetery of several graves site. And what has been heard on Site 1 has been the sound of chanting or praying at night. And this gets into the real strange Skinwalker type stuff. I mean, this gets into progressions of hooded figures at night on the county road. And one night the property owner came home late, seen this 6 figures going down the county road, hooded figures. Something he described it like it could have been monks or something like that, he said, from the back. And he was worried. He thought, actually, the guy thought that there was with a cemetery, he thought there was some kind of satanic thing going on or something, from town out there. So he went into his defensive mode on the property, and he carried a little 22 pistol. And he went after these things, and he ran down the county road yelling at them. And at one point, finally, the one in the end turned around and faced him. And now this is as Skinwalker as he gets. He describes it as having a long wolf-like face that stared at him with red eyes. And
Wow.
unwisely, he shot at this thing with a .22 pistol 3 times,
Oh.
and which is not a wise move.
No.
But it showed no effect of the being hit or anything, and they just progressed. And what he described at times then, before they went down the road out of sight, as he was running the other way, looking back, he said they appeared at times to just hover above the ground, and like they had went from walking to actually just hovering about a foot above the ground.
Oh,
Now,
my goodness.
I
bet he was scared to death.
Well, that's one of the reasons why the man will not come out at night.
Right.
And
I don't
with
blame
other
him.
experiences, yeah.
And that sounds like what you described, or what he described, like a true skinwalker.
Yes.
They take a wolf shape and then they can change into something else.
Yes.
The hooded, robed figure, though, is quite odd. I don't think I've heard that before with the wolf face.
Yes. And Ted didn't, and as you said, Ted being the nuts and bolts man for years, we put so many things on the back burner. If we couldn't log it and scientifically had data on it, physical trace evidence, Ted would rather we didn't speak about it. And but as you said, the learning process through the years, he felt that it was an obligation that we start letting out to the public some of what was going on out there. And that's an image there of Ted in the field on a long, I believe it was about 20 degrees that night we spent out there, and trying to image some of this northern light balls and activity. And it was it's incredible. And that's Adam Johnson, myself, and Debbie Ziegelmeyer. I like to refer to her as my sister, but we've been through a lot together. And that was a case where we were looking into a corral gate that the unseen force had broke a lock and pushed open into this one gated cattle run, and which the unseen force is a whole new, that's a whole nother ball game. The dealing with that, I will tell you. But you're dealing with so many things in Marley. I think that's why Jacques made that comment. He said the scope of things out there, the light balls, the unseen force, the phenomena known as the light beam, which we experienced ourselves and was detrimental. We had some effects from that physically, but of late we had 13-inch, 3-toed tracks on a pond in the early winter, which it was a thin ice, wouldn't have supported a man's weight, and they had found 13-inch on a light snow on a very light ice, where if you'd set a rock on it, it would have broke through the ice. And these 13-inch, 3-toed tracks went through the snow, terminated in the center of the pond. And how do you explain that?
On ice, on thin ice.
How could you support something with a 13-inch track, 3-toed track? Was this thing in transition again? Dimensionally? That's the only thing that can explain this. And it just goes on and on.
I mean, there aren't very many things with 3 toes either.
Not
that length. I mean,
no.
Yeah. What is it?
It makes absolutely no sense. And it can't be, but there it is.
Right. Now, you mentioned the unseen force. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that for just a minute. I know some people there have experienced some very, very heavy forces on their person and on their buildings, correct?
Yes, there were. It's not uncommon. There have been log chain gates that have been hit and pushed down. And I will add, this is in a secure, 1,200 acre ranch on a dirt road off a gravel road where nobody has access into this area. And what pushes down 2 steel gates, log chain together, and rips the hinge pins, turns the hinge pins in oak post, and these gates were found in the morning, pushed down, not bent, no paint scraped off them. It's just incredible amount of force. There's been individuals, there's been the property owners that owned on near the S.I.U, that owned some property near the S.I.U ranch, that were, the guy was checking his cattle one morning, and they were an older gentleman, and the wife stayed, they were headed to church, and the wife stayed in the car, and the older gentleman walked through the brush and walked to check on the cattle, and she looked back and he was gone, and she got out of the car, walked up to the area, and here her husband, which was a big man, he weighed well over 200 pounds, and but he was on the ground, and she asked, "What happened? Are you okay?" And he tried to get up, and he said, "Well, I don't know if I'm okay." And about that time, she was going to assist him. She felt 2 sharp taps or pushes on the back of her shoulders, knocked her to the ground, and she found herself laying on the ground. And this woman weighed probably around 265. So, out of the clear blue sky, no weather, beautiful morning, no wind. What does this? You're talking about an impact that hit these people, and they were both bruised at the point of impact on their back. So, and the gentleman, actually, when he fell, he injured his leg on a piece of branch, a stub in the ground, and got a bad infection from that, and really he almost passed away due to the infection. But so there again, that's eyewitness testimony that this unseen force, and there again, that's one that Ted had dealt with overseas, very prevalent in cases that did a lot of damage. Mm-hmm. So, you're dealing with a force there that's remarkable.
Yeah, it makes it, gosh, so many questions about that.
Yes.
There's one thing I want to ask. Has anybody there seen any winged creatures that they could not explain?
Yes. Actually, it's a very good documented case, and it couldn't come from a better witness than a veterinarian. But there was a woman veterinarian on Site 3 there. She was working some cattle for the one rancher, and she had her medical bag out. She had her truck in the field, and she was working on some inoculations, or I don't quite know what it was she was doing, but she's working on these cattle, and she hears, well, actually, first she feels a wind. She hears a large whooshing sound, or like the beat of wings, large wings, looks up in time to see a wing. At first, she described one as a winged serpent-like creature. Now, she's a veterinarian that knows anything that should be in that area, or in our, any part of Missouri, and said this was nothing she'd ever seen. So she jumps in her truck and goes in chase of this thing. The rancher actually came out to bring her lunch, and he comes out and finds her medical bag turned over and her vehicle gone. And he gets upset, worried about what happened to her. Mm-hmm. About that time, he sees her vehicle tearing across the field back to him. And she jumps out of the vehicle and runs up to him and says, "Have you ever seen anything strange in the air? Have you ever seen anything like a large winged creature?" And here again, that's typical at Marley. He had never seen. And we had no reports of this at Marley before this sighting.
So was that recent?
It was, within the last 10 years, I'll say. So it's not really real recent. But there again, her case wasn't brought out till one of Ted's later appearances when he spoke about this. But she actually, it formed, whenever the woman had any spare time, it so impressed her that she'd go out there with cameras on this ranch and drive around and sit there for hours trying to capture images of this again. She did catch one poor image, which I put up. I'll send you again. And It's a very poor image, and but you can see a large winged creature with a structure that fits no other flying type of bird or reptile or anything you can imagine. So it's truly, and she described it after she seen the creature. Actually, she's seen two of them together, she said. That one had a metallic look to it, almost like a machine. Now, that throws it in a whole nother realm, another possibility. So, there again, the one and only time this had ever been seen, that it was seen by a veterinarian working out in the field. So,
flying serpent is not a common thing. But so she sees that and she goes back to get photographs, and she photographs something else.
No, she actually got that day. She actually got a couple quick photos with her phone, and they're very poor images, of course. That was an earlier phone, and but she was gone back with a good camera, time after time, trying. She sits and waits for hours trying to, and they may never come. That's the way Marley is. It's never been seen there before that, and she experienced this, and Ted and others in this business, like Jacques they kind of had a theory about this. And just briefly, they wondered sometimes if, we're there to observe these things, and Ted called Marley a living laboratory. And they got to have the idea or wonder, as Ted said a couple times, I wonder sometimes if a lot of this isn't actually done for our benefit, to see how we'll react to this and how we'll respond. And is it to generate fear in us or a response? And he just felt at times some of the strangeness was maybe like it was putting us in observation to see how we'd respond. And, Jacques kind of agreed with that too. So you do have that.
Yeah. A lot of investigators feel that way when they go on an investigation that they're not involved in. They're investigating something else, but something happens while they're there. Well, what about the timing of that? That makes it feel like it was done on purpose for them to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. Ted mentioned to me in later years that he had some paranormal experiences. And I remember vaguely a story he told me, and he was in a car and a hand reached in, a disembodied hand grabbed his arm or something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
He had a couple experiences like that. And I will tell you, that stemmed from the experience he had in Marley that not much shook Ted Phillips. I'll tell you that. That night, when he was in that remote viewing station, the one image you put up with the blue tarp behind Ted, when he called for Adam and I to get there, that's the image. We got there. We drove 85 miles an hour on back roads to get to Ted. He heard a large wing flapping that could not be explained. It was beyond the capability of an owl or a bird. And it landed on the roof of this old barn structure that didn't have a wall. That's why the tarp was down on that side. And when he started, he heard something beating the tarp right there by him and actually punching this tarp in. And as he's sitting there, he turned the lantern up, and right on the edge of that tarp, he's seen what he described as non-human-like, dark-colored fingers, extremely long, grabbed the edge of the tarp and was pulling the tarp back away, so like it was going to enter where Ted was. And Ted yelled at this thing, and he said it dropped the tarp, and he said he could hear it jump on the roof again, run across the roof, and he could hear a thump like it jumped, and it would have had to clear an area of probably 50 foot and cleared a 4-strand barbed wire fence with a board on it. It was actually a cattle run there, and cleared it completely. And when we got there, Ted was shook up, and he had already called his wife. And but he did have experiences as you stated. After that, he and that's the way this stuff it gets. Sometimes when it affects you, Ed Marley, sometimes you have, let's just say, sometimes things do go home with you. So
yeah, indeed.
And physically, I will add too. So, but it's just, there's so much high strangeness at Marley. It's unbelievable. It really is.
There's a theory that certain places have natural portal openings, and that all types of interdimensional creatures can move in and out easily or more easily in those areas. Do you think that that's a possibility for this place?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do, for whatever reason. And like you experienced the paranormal, I never really experienced anything paranormal or that strange. I've had a couple of experiences when I was very young with UFOs, but at Marley, Ted warned me about, we had the property owners are so great at Marley. They built Ted this 2-story metal structure with an office and lodging on top and a kitchen underneath. And we slept on top there were 2 beds in there. And Ted warned me about it when I first started going to Marley. He said, be prepared. And I know Marley, the people think the bewitching hour is midnight. Well, in ufology and so much in the paranormal, it tends to be 3 a.m. And but Ted warned me about this. And I know one morning at 3 a.m., something woke me up. I felt something grab my arm, woke me up, and I am a sound sleeper the little I sleep. And I woke up with this intense euphoria that I just felt that's something I had to get out on the deck. And I can't explain why. I thought, man, I'm going to go out there. It just felt like I was going to see the mothership or something like that. I ran out on the deck to see and view absolutely nothing. Nothing else occurred. I couldn't see anything. I didn't experience anything. So I ran back in, and Ted was sleeping, and I woke Ted up, which is something you didn't want to often do, was wake Ted up, believe me. But I woke Ted up, and I explained to him what happened, and Ted just looked at me, and he said, well, Tom, he said, welcome to Marley Woods. And he rolled back over and went back to bed. So
Tom, this has been fascinating. I'd love to have you back on to talk about another case, a big case that Ted worked on sometime, if you wouldn't mind doing that. But we are running out of time this evening. What are your plans for the future?
Well, our plans for the future are, I'm working with people right now, and it's very serious in the early stages. We're working with one group that's going to do a documentary, possibly a series on Ted Phillips, his early years with Hynek after Blue Book, going into Marley Woods. We're working with another group of people on the Slovakian project, Project Moonshaft, and they're very serious. And so we're working with them, and it's a lot of work. And I can't tell you how much work it is to get things in motion these days with this virus.
Yeah.
Had it not been for this virus, I would say we'd been in the middle of doing the first season with these shows. Mm-hmm. But it's coming, so all I can say is stay tuned. We're going to make it happen, and we owe it to Ted. He wasn't a self-promoter, but we need to get his work out there to the public where he so wanted it.
Exactly. Well, I tell you what, Tom, thanks so much for your time this evening. It's fascinating stuff. I'm glad that you are keeping up with the work at Marley Woods, and I expect to see more great things coming out of that.
Well, thank you, Maury. It's been a pleasure, and anytime you need anything, just let me know.
I sure will. Thanks so much. This is Margie Kay. You're listening to UNX News. Join me here again next Friday night.
You've been listening to the UNX News Podcast with Margie K. Any rebroadcast or duplication of this program or its content without express written permission from Margie K. is strictly prohibited. The UNX News Podcast, in direct cooperation with the internet website margiek.com.